June 4, 1942. 10,200 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky stared at empty water where 4 Japanese aircraft carriers should have been. His fuel gauge read dangerously low. Behind him, 32 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers flew in formation, each pilot watching their own needles creep toward empty. Some aircraft had been airborne for nearly 3 hours. Engines that should have been shut down 30 minutes ago continued burning precious fuel with every passing second. Pilots calculated distances and consumption rates, doing mental arithmetic that added up to impossible choices. The morning had begun with confidence. Enterprise's flight deck crews had spotted aircraft with practiced efficiency. Pilots had climbed into their SBD cockpits, knowing the Japanese carriers were out there somewhere, knowing American codebreakers had given them the advantage of foreknowledge. But foreknowledge meant nothing if you couldn't find the enemy. And McClusky, staring at empty ocean, felt the weight of command pressing down like physical force. For months, Japanese naval officers had watched these aircraft approach their formations with something approaching contempt. The Americans called it the SBD, standing for Scout Bomber Douglas. The Japanese had their own name for it, Osoi Bakugeki Ki, the slow bomber. At 250 miles per hour maximum speed, the Dauntless couldn't outrun a Zero fighter. At cruising speed of 173 miles per hour, it barely moved faster than a training aircraft. Its 42-foot wingspan and 33-foot length gave it the proportions of a pudgy workhorse rather than a sleek thoroughbred. Japanese pilots joked that their nimble Zeros could dance circles around the lumbering American dive bombers while shredding them with cannon fire. What happened in the next 6 minutes would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one your enemy has already learned to dismiss. McClusky had launched from USS Enterprise at 0700 hours with a simple mission. Find 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and destroy them. Naval intelligence knew their approximate position. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had spent weeks deciphering Japanese communications, learning that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned to capture Midway Atoll and draw out the remaining American carriers for a decisive battle that would end the war in the Pacific. The Americans possessed 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Against them sailed the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the same carriers that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, the same elite air crews who had swept across the Pacific with the confidence of men who had never been defeated. McClusky's navigation had been perfect. He had flown to exactly where the Japanese carriers should have been, but the ocean stretched empty beneath his formation. No carriers, no escorts, just endless blue water reflecting the morning sun. Behind McClusky, fuel gauges crept lower. Some pilots calculated they had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time remaining. Not enough to search and return to Enterprise, not enough to make it to Midway Atoll if they turned back now. Just enough to make one critical decision that would either change the war or send 32 aircraft and 64 men into the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. McClusky faced the same question submarine commanders had grappled with for months. American torpedoes had failed so consistently that Japanese ships no longer bothered with aggressive, evasive maneuvers. Why waste fuel dodging weapons that rarely worked? The Mark 15 torpedo aboard American destroyers had become a joke whispered through the fleet from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane. Magnetic exploders that triggered too early, contact exploders that crumpled without detonating, weapons that ran too deep or circled back toward their own ships. The SBD Dauntless suffered from no such mechanical failures. Its 1,000-pound bomb worked exactly as designed every time. But the aircraft itself carried the stigma of being too slow, too vulnerable, too obsolete for modern warfare. Douglas Aircraft had designed it in the late 1930s using principles that seemed antiquated by 1942 standards. Its single Wright Cyclone engine produced just 1,000 horsepower. Its maximum speed fell 70 miles per hour slower than the Zero fighter. Its defensive armament consisted of two 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and two 30 caliber guns in the rear cockpit. Against the legendary Zero, these specifications appeared almost suicidal. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized speed and maneuverability above all else. Their Zero fighters could climb faster, turn tighter, and outrun anything the Americans had fielded in the first 6 months of war. Zero pilots attacked with the confidence of men flying superior machines flown by superior pilots. They had proven their dominance at Pearl Harbor, Wake Island, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros described aircraft that seemed to defy physics, rolling and turning with impossible agility. The Imperial Navy's carrier doctrine reflected this technological and tactical superiority. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the First Air Fleet with 4 carriers that could launch over 200 aircraft. His aircrews were the most experienced in the world. Many had flown combat missions in China since 1937. They knew their aircraft intimately. They understood the rhythm of carrier operations. They had rehearsed coordinated strikes until execution became automatic. Against this elite force, the Americans could field 3 carriers with crews who had precious little combat experience. Most SBD pilots had received their wings within the past year. They had trained in dive bombing but lacked the combat seasoning of their Japanese opponents. Their aircraft seemed hopelessly outmatched, slow, vulnerable, flying museum pieces against the finest naval aviation force ever assembled. But McClusky knew something the Japanese had not yet learned. Speed meant nothing if you couldn't find your target. Maneuverability meant nothing if the enemy attacked from above with the sun at their backs. Superior numbers meant nothing if your carriers were caught with aircraft on deck being refueled and rearmed. The Battle of Midway would not be decided by which side flew faster aircraft or had more experienced pilots. It would be decided by which side made the correct decisions in the handful of critical moments, when perfect information gave way to calculated risk. McClusky stared at his fuel gauge again. 20 minutes at most. The Japanese carriers had changed course from their expected heading. They were somewhere out there, but where? South toward Midway as originally planned, west following an alternate approach, north executing some tactical maneuver he hadn't anticipated. A fighter pilot by training, McClusky had never dropped a bomb from an SBD until a few weeks before Midway. Air Group Commander was an administrative position he had assumed in April when his predecessor transferred. He knew fighter tactics intimately, but dive-bombing doctrine remained unfamiliar territory. His squadron commanders, Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher of Scouting 6 and Lieutenant Richard Best of Bombing 6, understood the SBD's capabilities and limitations far better than McClusky did. Yet command responsibility fell to McClusky. He had to decide. Turn back and save his aircraft and crews for another day? Continue searching with fuel, running dangerously low? Land at Midway and hope ground crews could refuel his aircraft in time to be useful? The Pacific War balanced on this moment. If the Japanese carriers destroyed Midway's air defenses and captured the atoll, they would possess a forward base within striking distance of Hawaii. They could threaten the West Coast. They could force the Americans to accept a negotiated peace that left Japan dominant across the Pacific. Everything depended on finding those 4 carriers and destroying them before they could launch another strike. Everything depended on 32 slow dive bombers flown by young pilots in aircraft the Japanese had learned to dismiss as obsolete. McClusky made his decision based on logic rather than hope. Multiple PBY Catalina patrol aircraft were searching the waters west and south of Midway. If the Japanese carriers had continued on their expected heading, someone would have reported them by now. The silence suggested the carriers had turned north. McClusky turned his formation to follow that intuition. 15 minutes later, at 09:55, his decision proved correct. A lone Japanese destroyer appeared below, cutting a white wake through blue water at maximum speed. The destroyer Arashi had remained behind to depth charge the American submarine Nautilus after the sub attempted multiple attacks on Japanese surface ships. Now Arashi raced northeast to rejoin the carrier force. McClusky followed the destroyer like a bloodhound following a scent. 10 minutes later, at 10:05, smoke appeared on the horizon. Wakes became visible. Ships materialized from morning haze. 4 aircraft carriers steaming in a loose box formation surrounded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The entire strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy spread below like targets on a practice range. McClusky's fuel situation had reached critical. Some pilots would run dry before reaching Enterprise even if they departed immediately. But departing immediately meant leaving 4 carriers untouched, leaving them free to launch strikes against American carriers whose locations the Japanese now knew. Leaving them free to complete their mission of capturing Midway and threatening Hawaii, McClusky keyed his radio for the first time since leaving Enterprise. "This is Hornet Air Group Commander. We have located the main Japanese carrier force, preparing to attack." The transmission went out garbled by distance and atmospheric interference, but it didn't matter. McClusky had found the enemy. Now came the hard part. Destroying them before Japanese Zeros swarmed his slow, vulnerable dive bombers and turned the Pacific blue with American blood. Aboard the carrier Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo reviewed reports from his morning strike against Midway Atoll. The attack had damaged facilities and destroyed aircraft, but the island's defenses remained operational. His strike commander recommended a second attack to suppress anti-aircraft batteries and finish the job. Nagumo's deck crews began switching his aircraft from ship attack loadouts to land attack configurations. Torpedoes came off. High explosive bombs went on. Fuel hoses snaked across flight decks as mechanics topped off tanks for the second Midway strike. The rearming process required meticulous coordination. Ordnancemen wheeled heavy torpedoes back to ammunition elevators. Other crew members brought up high-explosive bombs from magazines below. Each aircraft required careful handling as fuel lines connected and disconnected. Aviation gasoline vapors filled the hangar decks. The volatile mixture of fuel fumes, exposed ordnance, and cramped spaces created conditions that carrier crews understood represented extreme danger, but accepted as necessary for conducting operations. Japanese carriers had been designed with speed and offensive capability prioritized over defensive protection. Their hangars remained open to allow rapid aircraft movement and maximum ventilation. But this design philosophy also meant fires could spread with frightening speed once started. Damage control parties stood ready with firefighting equipment, but the sheer volume of fuel and ordnance on board meant any significant hit could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. No radar warned of approaching aircraft. Japanese radar technology lagged years behind American systems. The Type 21 radar mounted on some Japanese ships could detect surface targets, but lacked the range and precision of American equipment. Their warning net depended on human lookouts, scanning empty sky with binoculars and hoping to spot incoming strikes before they arrived overhead. On this bright June morning, with unlimited visibility and not a cloud in the sky, lookouts saw nothing. The Americans approached from the southwest with the sun at their backs, exactly as doctrine prescribed. They descended from 10,000 feet, where aircraft appeared as tiny specks easily, mistaken for distant birds. The Japanese carriers steamed confidently through water they considered secure. They had destroyed one wave of American torpedo bombers an hour earlier, watching obsolete TBD devastators lumber toward their ships at low altitude, where Zeros could shred them like paper targets. Not a single American torpedo had struck home. The sacrifice of 41 American aviators had achieved nothing except confirming Japanese tactical superiority. The survivors of Torpedo 8, Torpedo 6, and Torpedo 3 had died, believing their attacks failed completely. They could not know their sacrifice had pulled every Japanese Zero down to wave-top level, where the fighters burned fuel and ammunition, destroying slow-moving torpedo bombers. They could not know their attacks had forced Japanese carriers to maneuver violently, disrupting deck operations and delaying the planned strike against American carriers. They could not know they had positioned Japanese fighters exactly, where they could not intercept the dive bombers now approaching from 10,000 feet above. McClusky studied the Japanese formation through binoculars. 4 carriers arranged in a loose box with Akagi and Kaga to the south, Soryu and Hiryu to the north. Battleships and cruisers steamed in the center of the formation, where their anti-aircraft batteries could provide concentrated fire. Destroyers patrolled the perimeter. It was a textbook defensive formation designed to maximize firepower against low-level torpedo attacks. It was almost useless against dive bombers attacking from directly overhead. The Americans possessed 33 aircraft, not enough bombs to guarantee destruction of all 4 carriers. McClusky made the tactical decision to concentrate on the 2 nearest carriers, Akagi and Kaga. Sink 2 carriers now rather than damage all 4 and allow them to recover. Standard Navy doctrine called for the leading squadron to attack the far target, while the trailing squadron hit the near target. 2 simultaneous attacks would split defensive fire and maximize the chances of both squadrons completing their runs. McClusky, unfamiliar with dive-bombing doctrine, made a critical mistake. He ordered both squadrons to attack Kaga, the nearer carrier. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher's Scouting 6 followed McClusky into their diving attack. Lieutenant Richard Best's Bombing 6 prepared to follow doctrine and attack Akagi, but suddenly found themselves following the entire Enterprise air group toward Kaga. Best had 3 seconds to make a decision that would affect the outcome of the battle. Follow doctrine and attack Akagi alone, or follow McClusky and Gallagher to ensure overwhelming force against Kaga. Best chose doctrine. He broke off with his 2 wingmen and rolled into a 70-degree dive toward Akagi, while the remaining 30 aircraft screamed down toward Kaga. The Japanese carriers had perhaps 20 seconds of warning before the first bombs struck. Lookouts spotted aircraft diving from directly overhead and shouted warnings that came too late for meaningful response. Akagi and Kaga threw their rudders hard over and attempted emergency turns that came too late and moved too slowly. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts that missed the diving aircraft by hundreds of feet. The gunners had trained to engage low-level torpedo bombers, not dive bombers plummeting from above at terminal velocity. The SBD Dauntless excelled at exactly this type of attack. Douglas aircraft had designed the plane specifically for precision dive bombing from steep angles. Perforated split flaps on the wings acted as air brakes, allowing pilots to maintain control during near-vertical dives, while keeping their speed low enough to aim accurately. The Wright Cyclone engine's reliability meant pilots could focus entirely on their target without worrying about mechanical failure. The sturdy airframe could handle forces that would tear apart lesser aircraft. At 10:26 on the morning of June 4, 1942, the SBD Dauntless stopped being the slow bomber Japanese pilots dismissed and became the most effective carrier-killing weapon in naval history. Best's first bomb struck Akagi's flight deck amidships, penetrating through to the upper hangar deck where 18 fully fueled and fully armed aircraft sat waiting to launch. The explosion triggered secondary detonations that ripped through the carrier like chain lightning. Fuel tanks burst into fireballs. Bombs cooked off and detonated. Torpedoes exploded in their racks. Within 90 seconds, Akagi transformed from a functional carrier into a burning wreck that would take the rest of the day to sink, but was finished as a fighting ship from the moment Best's bomb struck. Aboard Kaga, the situation proved even more catastrophic. Earl Gallagher's Scouting 6 and the majority of Richard Best's Bombing 6 converged on the carrier with overwhelming force. At least 4,000-pound bombs struck Kaga's flight deck in rapid succession. Each penetrated through to the hangar deck, where aircraft sat fully fueled and armed. The first explosion triggered a chain reaction that consumed the entire ship. Fuel tanks burst, ammunition cooked off, torpedoes detonated in their storage racks. Within 3 minutes, Kaga transformed from a functioning carrier into a blazing funeral pyre that would burn for hours before sinking. 3 miles to the north, Yorktown's Bombing 3 under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie found Soryu attempting emergency maneuvers to avoid the diving aircraft. 3 bombs struck the carrier in quick succession. The first hit forward of the bridge, the second struck amidships near the number 2 elevator, the third exploded near the stern. All 3 bombs penetrated to the hangar deck, where 99 aircraft sat waiting to launch. The resulting explosions gutted Soryu from stem to stern. Her captain ordered abandon ship 20 minutes later. She would sink that evening, taking 800 men with her. Mitsuo Fuchida, the air commander who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, stood on Akagi's bridge, recovering from appendicitis surgery that had grounded him for this battle. He watched 3 black dots materialize from empty sky above his flagship. A lookout screamed warnings that came too late. Machine guns fired frantic bursts that missed completely. Then, black objects floated eerily from the diving aircraft's wings. Bombs, falling toward his ship with mathematical precision. The explosion that followed changed naval warfare forever. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's midship elevator and penetrated through to the upper hangar deck. It detonated among 18 fully fueled and fully armed aircraft waiting to launch. The blast wave propagated through the confined hangar space with devastating effect. Aircraft disintegrated, fuel tanks burst into fireballs that consumed everything combustible. Bombs cooked off and detonated. Torpedoes exploded in chain reactions that tore through bulkheads like tissue paper. Fuchida felt the deck heave beneath his feet as secondary explosions rippled through Akagi's guts. Smoke poured from elevator shafts. Flames roared up from below decks. Electrical systems failed. Steam lines ruptured. Communications went dead. Within 90 seconds, Akagi had been reduced from the flagship of the Imperial Japanese Navy to a burning wreck that would take 9 hours of desperate damage control efforts before finally succumbing and sinking. The entire attack lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which American dive bombers destroyed 3 Japanese fleet carriers and mortally wounded the pride of the Imperial Navy. 6 minutes that changed the strategic balance of the Pacific War, from Japanese offensive dominance to American counteroffensive capability. 6 minutes that proved the SBD Dauntless, dismissed as slow and obsolete, was the most effective carrier-killing weapon ever deployed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese Zero pilots, who had spent the morning at low altitude massacring American torpedo bombers, looked up in horror as their carriers erupted in flames. They lacked the fuel to pursue the retreating dive bombers. They lacked the altitude to intercept aircraft that had already completed their dives and were racing away at sea level. They could only watch as 6 months of carefully cultivated naval superiority burned before their eyes. The Americans lost 18 SBDs during the attacks. Some fell to Japanese fighters during their dives. Others succumbed to anti-aircraft fire. Several ran out of fuel before reaching their carriers, but the exchange ratio proved devastating for Japan. 18 dive bombers and their crews in exchange for 3 fleet carriers, over 300 aircraft, and approximately 2,000 trained personnel who could never be replaced. Each pilot who failed to return represented years of training and accumulated experience that American flight schools could replace in months. Japanese training programs, already strained by operational demands, could not produce replacement pilots at anywhere near American rates. The Imperial Navy had entered the war with approximately 3,500 trained carrier pilots. Losses at Coral Sea and Midway had already reduced that number by nearly 10%. American training programs graduated thousands of new pilots every month, each receiving hundreds of hours of flight time before reaching operational squadrons. The pilot shortage would plague Japanese naval aviation for the remainder of the war. Veterans who survived early battles flew mission after mission without adequate rest, their skills degrading from exhaustion and stress. New pilots joined squadrons with minimal training, learning combat techniques through trial and error that cost many their lives. The elite force that had attacked Pearl Harbor gradually dissolved into a shadow of its former capability, unable to replace losses or maintain the training standards that had made it so formidable. Lieutenant Richard Best landed aboard Enterprise with his fuel gauge reading nearly empty. His oxygen system had malfunctioned during the dive, exposing him to caustic soda fumes that activated latent tuberculosis. He would never fly combat again, medically retired in March 1944 as a lieutenant commander. The greatest dive bomber pilot in the Pacific Fleet had destroyed 2 Japanese carriers in one day, then been grounded by a faulty oxygen bottle. He expected to fight the entire war. Instead, his combat career lasted exactly one perfect mission. Best's story epitomized the razor-thin margins that separated victory from defeat in carrier warfare. A properly functioning oxygen system, and he would have continued flying combat missions throughout the Pacific campaign. Instead, one faulty bottle ended the career of the only pilot at Midway to sink 2 carriers in a single day. His 2 wingmen, Ensign Frederick Weber and Lieutenant Edwin Kroger, had followed him through every second of the attack on Akagi. Their bombs had missed or caused only minor damage. But Best's single bomb strike in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment had doomed Japan's flagship carrier. Wade McClusky returned to Enterprise with 52 bullet holes in his aircraft and a shoulder wound from Japanese shrapnel. His fuel tank registered less than 5 gallons remaining. 5 gallons that represented the margin between finding the Japanese carriers and running out of fuel over empty ocean. 5 gallons that represented the difference between American victory and Japanese triumph. Admiral Chester Nimitz would later state that without McClusky's decision to turn north and follow the destroyer Arashi, the war might have lasted 3 additional years. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, had been hidden by weather during the initial attacks. She launched 2 counterstrikes against Yorktown, bombing and torpedoing the American carrier until she had to be abandoned. But American scout planes located Hiryu later that afternoon. Enterprise and Hornet launched their remaining aircraft for a final strike. At 1700 hours, SBDs from both carriers found Hiryu and delivered the same devastating attack that had destroyed her sister carriers that morning. 4 bombs struck the carrier in rapid succession. She burned through the night before being scuttled by Japanese destroyers the following morning. In the space of 12 hours on June 4, 1942, American dive bombers had destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the same elite air crews who had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable momentum, all gone. Sunk by aircraft the Japanese had learned to dismiss as too slow to matter. Japanese naval officers who survived Midway struggled to comprehend what had happened. Their carriers had been caught in the most vulnerable condition possible. Flight decks loaded with fully fueled and fully armed aircraft, refueling hoses snaked everywhere, ordnance scattered across hangar decks, pilots in their cockpits waiting for launch orders. The Americans had achieved the perfect strike at the perfect moment against targets that could not have been more vulnerable. But the vulnerability itself resulted from Japanese overconfidence. Admiral Nagumo had ordered his aircraft rearmed twice that morning, first from ship attack loadouts to land attack configurations for a second strike against Midway, then back to ship attack loadouts when American carriers were reported in the area. Each rearming evolution consumed precious time and left his carriers, cluttered with ordnance and fuel lines. The chaos of changing loadouts twice meant no aircraft could launch during the critical window when American dive bombers appeared overhead. Japanese doctrine emphasized speed and aggression, but assumed American forces would behave predictably. The assumption proved fatal. American torpedo bombers had attacked exactly as Japanese doctrine predicted, approaching at low altitude where Zeros could massacre them. But American dive bombers attacked from 10,000 feet where no Japanese fighters patrolled because all had been pulled down to destroy the torpedo bombers. The sacrifice of 41 torpedo bomber crews had been absolutely essential to the success of the dive bomber attacks that followed. The psychological impact on surviving Japanese naval personnel proved as devastating as the material losses. They had entered battle confident in their technological superiority, tactical excellence, and combat experience. They emerged from Midway, shattered by the realization that American forces had outthought, outmaneuvered, and outfought the finest naval aviation force ever assembled. The myth of Japanese invincibility died in the flames that consumed Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. The SBD Dauntless had proven its worth in the most decisive manner possible. Its slow maximum speed meant nothing when attacking from above. Its apparent vulnerability meant nothing when pilots dove through clouds of anti-aircraft fire and emerged unscathed. Its obsolete design meant nothing when its bombs struck with devastating accuracy. The aircraft Japanese pilots had mocked as Osoi Bakugeki had destroyed 4 carriers in 6 minutes. Speed mattered less than accuracy. Maneuverability mattered less than timing. Superior numbers mattered less than striking first with overwhelming force at the critical moment. The Battle of Midway continued for 3 more days as American forces pursued the retreating Japanese fleet. But the decisive action had occurred in those 6 minutes on the morning of June 4th when dive bombers appeared from empty sky and transformed the strategic balance of the Pacific War. Admiral Yamamoto attempted to salvage the operation by bringing up his battleships for a surface engagement. He commanded 10 battleships, including the massive Yamato, with 9 18-inch guns, the most powerful warship afloat. Against this force, the Americans could field only 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, both low on aircraft and fuel. But Admirals Fletcher and Spruance refused to be drawn into a night surface battle where Japanese advantages in training and equipment would predominate. They withdrew to the east, maintaining distance while their submarines harassed Japanese surface forces. Yamamoto realized that without carrier air support, his battleships were simply targets for American land-based bombers from Midway. He ordered a general retreat on June 5th. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The plan to draw out and destroy American carriers had failed catastrophically. The strategic implications rippled across the Pacific theater for the remainder of the war. Japan had lost 4 irreplaceable carriers and approximately 100 trained pilots. American industry could replace lost carriers in months. Japanese shipyards required years to build new carriers, and the trained aircrews who had flown from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu could never be replaced at all. 6 months of combat experience, years of training, and institutional knowledge gained from operations dating back to the China campaign in 1937 all vanished into the Pacific, along with the 4 carriers. The offensive capability of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been broken. Never again would Japanese carriers operate with the freedom and confidence they had displayed in the first 6 months of war. Every subsequent operation would be conducted with the knowledge that American dive bombers could appear from nowhere and destroy carriers in minutes. The psychological advantage that had sustained Japanese morale through months of conquest evaporated in the flames of Midway. American naval doctrine underwent immediate revision based on lessons learned. The SBD Dauntless, previously considered adequate but unexceptional, suddenly became the most valuable aircraft in the carrier air group. Dive bomber squadrons received priority for personnel and equipment. Training programs emphasized the precision dive bombing techniques that had proven so devastatingly effective at Midway. The coordination between torpedo bombers, sacrificing themselves at low altitude, and dive bombers attacking from above, became standard doctrine that would be repeated throughout the Pacific campaign. The Zero fighter, once considered invincible, revealed critical vulnerabilities. Its lack of armor and self-sealing fuel tanks meant even 30 caliber rounds from an SBD's rear gunner could bring one down. Its emphasis on maneuverability at the expense of durability meant American pilots who survived initial encounters learned to exploit Zero weaknesses. The thatch-weave defensive maneuver, used successfully by Fighting 3 during Midway, became standard training for all American fighter pilots. Japanese tactical doctrine never fully recovered from the shock of Midway. Carrier operations became increasingly cautious. The aggressive tactics that had characterized the first 6 months of war gave way to defensive positioning designed to minimize exposure to American air attack. The initiative in the Pacific War shifted permanently to American forces who could now plan offensive operations rather than reacting to Japanese advances. The industrial implications proved even more significant than the tactical lessons. American shipyards accelerated carrier production schedules based on Midway's demonstration that carrier air power determined Pacific naval supremacy. The Essex-class carriers, already under construction, received priority for resources and personnel. Within 18 months, new American carriers would outnumber all remaining Japanese carriers combined. The industrial capacity that had impressed Japanese strategic planners before the war now became focused on producing the specific weapon systems that had proven most effective at Midway. Japan's carrier construction programs could not match American production rates. The carriers lost at Midway represented years of construction and decades of operational experience. Replacing them required resources Japan increasingly lacked as American submarines strangled Japanese merchant shipping. Oil imports dropped steadily as tankers fell victim to American torpedoes. Raw materials became scarce as supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean now patrolled by American aircraft and submarines. The industrial base that had sustained 6 months of conquest slowly starved as American forces severed the supply routes connecting Japan to conquered territories. 6 months after Midway, American forces landed on Guadalcanal and began the long campaign to recapture territory lost in the first months of war. SBD Dauntless dive bombers flew from Henderson Field, the captured Japanese airstrip, and sank Japanese warships attempting to reinforce their garrison. The aircraft that had destroyed 4 carriers at Midway proved equally effective against cruisers, destroyers, and transports, trying to navigate the waters around the Solomon Islands. The Japanese nickname for the SBD, Osoi Bakugeki Ki, the slow bomber, gradually disappeared from Japanese communications. Replacement pilots lacked the combat experience to appreciate the aircraft's apparent vulnerabilities. They only knew that American dive bombers appeared without warning, struck with devastating accuracy, and disappeared before Japanese fighters could intercept. The mockery that had characterized early war attitudes gave way too, cautious respect born of repeated bitter experience. American pilots who flew the SBD Dauntless developed deep affection for an aircraft that brought them home despite seemingly impossible odds. Dozens returned to their carriers with hundreds of bullet holes, damaged control surfaces, and wounded crew members. The rugged airframe absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. The reliable Wright Cyclone engine kept running despite battle damage that should have caused catastrophic failure. The perforated dive brakes allowed precise bomb delivery even when pilots were wounded or disoriented. The aircraft earned its nickname honestly. Slow but deadly became the proud designation of an aircraft that had destroyed more Japanese shipping than any other American weapon system in the first 2 years of Pacific combat. 6 carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 15 transports, and numerous smaller vessels fell victim to SBD attacks between December 1941 and December 1943. The total tonnage sunk exceeded 300,000 tons, representing a significant portion of Japan's naval strength. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The wreckage of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu rests on the floor of the Pacific Ocean at depths exceeding 17,000 feet. Research vessels located the carriers in 2019 using advanced sonar and submersible technology. The images revealed aircraft carriers preserved in remarkable condition despite 7 decades underwater. Flight decks tilted at impossible angles. Superstructures collapsed, but the essential shape of each carrier remained recognizable. Monuments to technological change and tactical innovation frozen in time at the moment of their destruction. The men who flew SBD Dauntless dive bombers at Midway became legends in American naval aviation history. Richard Best, Wade McClusky, Maxwell Leslie, Earl Gallagher, Norman Kleiss, and dozens of others whose names deserve remembrance proved that courage, training, and determination could overcome apparent technological disadvantages. They flew aircraft dismissed as obsolete into the teeth of the finest air defense force ever assembled and emerged victorious through a combination of skill, timing, and the perfect execution of doctrine under impossible pressure. The Battle of Midway demonstrated that modern naval warfare had shifted permanently from surface gun battles to carrier airstrikes. Battleships, once considered the measure of naval power, became floating anti-aircraft platforms, whose primary mission involved protecting carriers. The carrier-centric doctrine that emerged from Midway would dominate naval thinking for the remainder of World War II and continue through the Cold War into the 21st century. Japanese naval officers who survived Midway spent the remainder of the war grappling with a fundamental question. How had the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 4 carriers to an enemy flying aircraft considered inferior? The answer lay not in technology, but in doctrine, timing, and the willingness of American torpedo bomber crews to sacrifice themselves, drawing Japanese fighters to low altitude where they could not intercept the dive bombers that followed. It lay in Wade McClusky's decision to turn north and follow a lone destroyer. It lay in Richard Best's split-second choice to break formation and attack Akagi alone. It lay in the SBD Dauntless, proving that speed mattered less than accuracy when striking from above with 1,000-pound bombs that worked exactly as designed. The aircraft Japanese pilots called slow had travelled fast enough to change history. 6 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing had destroyed 6 months of Japanese naval dominance. The myth that American forces were technologically inferior and tactically incompetent died in the same flames that consumed 4 Japanese carriers. From June 4, 1942 forward, every Japanese naval operation would be conducted with the knowledge that American dive bombers could appear without warning and destroy carriers in minutes. The SBD Dauntless flew combat missions throughout the Pacific War, gradually being replaced by newer aircraft as American industry produced more advanced designs. But at the critical moment when the Pacific War balanced on a knife edge between Japanese conquest and American resistance, the slow dive bomber proved to be exactly the right weapon in the right place at the right time. History would record that 3 American carriers defeated 4 Japanese carriers at Midway. The truth was simpler. 32 SBD Dauntless dive bombers flown by young pilots who refused to accept that their slow aircraft couldn't compete with faster Japanese fighters had destroyed the finest naval aviation force ever assembled in 6 minutes of perfect execution.